Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. We're pleased to be hosting this exciting event. My name is Dighton Head, and I'm the chapter director for Ratio Christi, the apologetics club on campus. Just let me say this is the most amazing group of young people that I've worked with since I've been in this capacity. Would the members of Ratio Christi just stand, be recognized? We've only got a few of them here because they've got classes, but we've got several of them moving around. Okay, but Ratio Christi is Latin for the reason of Christ. It's our international organization is dedicated to providing historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Christ. We would like to thank our supporters for allowing us to put on this and future events. If you would like to see what we're doing, or if you think this organization is worthwhile as an investment for the kingdom of Christ, come see me later, and we have a table outside. Today we are honored to be hosting Dr. Gary Habermas and Robert Rucker to talk about the latest research into the Shroud of Turin. Dr. Gary Habermas has dedicated his professional life to the examination of the relevant historical, philosophical, and theological issues surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus. His extensive list of publications and debates provides a thorough account of the current state of the issue. He has also contributed more than 60 chapters or articles to additional books and over 100 articles and reviews in journals and other publications. In recent years, he has been a visiting and adjunct professor at about 15 different graduate schools and seminaries in the U.S. and abroad. Dr. Habermas is a distinguished research professor of apologetics and philosophy at the Rawlings School of Divinity here at Liberty University. Robert A. Rucker is a nuclear engineer working in the industry for 38 years in advanced nuclear reactor design, statistical analysis of measurement data for fissile material inventories, and criticality safety for fissile material production and handling. He has been researching and promoting the Shroud of Turin full-time since early 2014. He formed nuclear analysis computer calculations to solve the C14 dating problem for the Shroud of Turin, organized a team to do research on the Shroud in Richland, Washington, and organized the International Conference on the Shroud of Turin held in July 19 through 22nd in 2017 in Pasco, Washington. I'll give our guests the floor.
Come on. Hi everyone, my name is David Ohopsky. I'm going to be talking towards that, even though I know you're over here. I'm going to be talking to the camcorder because we're going to be putting this all online. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody at Ratio Christi at Liberty for helping to put this together so quickly. This was a very short notice type of thing, and you know, we weren't able to get the largest auditorium or anything, but we are really happy to present this research, and we really want this to become widespread. Bob has put a lot of research into the Shroud of Turin. I mean, just looking at the research for the past couple weeks alone, I'm pretty astounded at how much you yourself have done to compile the evidence and put it together in such a such a easy, comprehensible way. So yeah, I'd like to thank Dighton and Ashley. Where's Ashley? She's probably out there. And Kendra and Devontae. You guys were super in just getting stuff done right when I needed it. We were able to get the equipment going in the room and everything. So we really appreciate that. So I'm the community apologist of Lynchburg. For anybody that would like to know about Ratio Christi, come to me. If you'd like to start a chapter, come to me. I'm helping to develop the Ratio Christi in this area. We have a college prep at EC Glass already going. We have a Ratio Christi at Lynchburg College and possibly Randolph College forming with Kevin back there. He's joining Ratio Christi. He was actually an adjunct professor online here, and he stopped doing that so he could help work with Ratio Christi because he sees the potential that we have. So we have a lot of fun stuff going on, so be on the lookout for that. So the format of this dialogue is pretty simple. I'll just be asking a few questions, general introductory questions, and I'll open the floor to each speaker to elaborate on what they have to say about each thing. This talk is made more to disseminate the information for people who are not fully aware of what the Shroud of Turin is, or the implications of it, or anything like that. And for more in-depth information, we will be linking tons of stuff to our webpage that we put out, and we'll be putting this video out, hopefully on the Ratio Christi official YouTube, and then also on our webpage at ratiochristi.liberty.org or ratiochristi.org/liberty. So be on the lookout for that if you'd like to get more information about it. So yeah, let's jump right in. So for those of us who might not be familiar with the topic, what is the Shroud of Turin? I'll start with you.
The Shroud of Turin is
It's on. It's just
okay.
Through the
All right. Okay. The Shroud of Turin is a piece of linen, 14 feet 3 inches long by 3 feet 7 inches wide. David, if you can hold that. In fact, if you can hold this up in front of me, I'm going to show one thing.
Sure.
It was wrapped lengthways around a dead body. So if this is the body, the cloth is wrapped this way, and you open it up, and there's a gap between the two heads because there's a front and a back image. If you open it up, it opens this way, as you can see from there's a little gap, so apparently looped there between the head, and there's a water stain there between the head. That's because the shroud's been involved in 2 fires. That one's 1532, and they crammed the thing down in water to put it out, and so there's watermarks all over the cloth. The man is buried. David, if I give this back to you. The man is buried, his left hand over his right hand. His body is in a state of rigor mortis. His head is frozen in a slightly, well, in fact, you could see it here in this 16th century painting. They have it so that it looks like his head is on the man's leg, his thigh, when he's burying him. I think they're trying to, I'm just guessing, I don't know how they knew it back then, but it looks like they're trying to explain the fact that his head is frozen in a forward direction in rigor mortis. Left hand crossed over the right. You can see the wound in the left wrist. You can't see the wound in the right wrist, but you can see the twofold, the blood, 2 directions going up the arm. The left knee is up like this in a state of rigor mortis, and the foot is, the left foot is moved toward the right foot, causing people to think that it's likely that there may have been a single nail affixing the 2 feet. I don't know how much more you want me to say. The man, just at looks, just appearances, he's apparently been crucified, has all the famous marks. Although I will say this, maybe we'll have time to go back to this. If your son or daughter comes home and says, I'm going to do a report in school on crucifixion, help me do it. If they said, I'm going to go look at the Gospels, you would think, oh, all right, go for it. Well, actually, that would be a bad idea if you're doing a report on crucifixion in general, because what was done to Jesus is not normal crucifixion procedure, and probably a half dozen different points. The strange thing is that the man in the shroud has all half dozen odd things done to him too. And so, I mean, the view you almost have to come up with, and Bob can address this, but the view you almost have to come up with is that they either crucified some poor soul as a copycat of Jesus, because so many odd things were done to Jesus. I mean, here's just one. Why do you crucify a guy? Why do you put a crown of thorns on somebody who's crucified as a criminal? And someone says, well, that's because he claimed to be the Messiah or something. Well, right away you separated Jesus from everybody else who's ever been crucified. I mean, how many Messiahs have been crucified? So, at any rate, those are one of the many differences, but that is one of the ways to tell that the man in the shroud may have been Jesus's, because it seems like your choices are crucify a guy to look like Jesus, or it's Jesus. And if it's crucified to look like Jesus, the natural thesis, you can't explain 6 to 10 different scientific figures on the shroud. I mean, how do you have an image when there's hundreds of cloths in existence and no other images? No other body. There's blood and decomposition, but no other body images. So if you're crucifying this guy to look like Jesus, how do you get the image there? And things like that. So the mimic hypothesis doesn't work at a bunch of points. Here's a really good one, and then I'll stop and let Bob go with his. If you're mimicking Jesus, because let's just say you're into making money, and you want to put this thing out there in the Middle Ages, and you want to make a lot of bucks, don't put the nails in the wrists. It's stupid. Philip McNair, an art historian, says he has studied hundreds of pieces of medieval crucifixion art, and nothing else but the shroud has nails in the wrists. Every other painting and artifact has nails in the palm. If you put it in the wrist, it's a huge signal that you're doing a false Messiah or something, or whatever the equivalent would be in the Middle Ages, and it's not Jesus. So, that's just one sign that the mimicry thesis, that one indication has failed.
So Gary touched on a lot of different issues. Bob, I was hoping you could provide some historical context into the Shroud of Turin, because I think the biggest debate seems to be revolved around where did it originate historically. So could you give us a little bit of information about that?
Yeah, there's several different areas that can be looked at to determine the history on the Shroud of Turin. There's traditions, there's documents, there's DNA, there's pollen. There's about 5 or 6 different areas that the historians and the scientists have to work together into a consistent picture. And the picture that arises out of consideration of all of those items is that it was in Jerusalem. Actually, there's DNA evidence that perhaps it was made in India, because there's that type of DNA significantly on the shroud, which is very interesting. But it was in Jerusalem area because of the pollen that's on it. Now, again and again, the statement arises when you consider these details. No forger, no artist would know to put pollen on it from Jerusalem. No one would say, well, in 400 years you're going to be inventing something called a microscope where they can see the pollen, and therefore I have to find pollen. How would they know what pollen is in the Middle Ages, and so on? So the picture that arises is that it started in Jerusalem, and this is one and the same as the Shroud of Jesus that was discovered by Peter and John in the tomb. And of course, people are collectors. I think we all are to some extent. We collect, books and pictures and signatures and stamps, and it goes on and on. And so they wouldn't just leave the burial cloth and the face cloth in the tomb. No, they wouldn't have left it. They wouldn't have reused it. They wouldn't have burned it. They wouldn't have thrown it out. They would have protected it because it had the blood of Jesus on it. And you can imagine in theology how important the blood of Jesus is. So they would have kept it. They would have tried to keep these items away from destruction. It evidently was either taken, there's 2 different theories as to where it went primarily. One is the older concept is that it went up to Edessa, Turkey. That kind of the newer concept is that it was taken up to Antioch, which was the center of Christianity, and then used in apologetics and evangelistic work up in Asia Minor and going to Edessa, Turkey briefly. And that seems to be substantiated by Galatians 3:1, which is an interesting verse. It says, you Galatians, I'm so surprised that you're departing from the faith so quickly, even after being shown a portrayal before your very eyes of Jesus clearly being crucified. And what would that be? Well, the only thing that I could think of would be the actual Shroud of Turin. Right. So then it was taken to Constantinople as the main center of culture as time progressed. It was then evidently stolen in 1204 from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, and then went underground for 150 years because it was stolen goods, finally surfacing in northern France, and it was shown in a small hamlet called Lorey, France, in about 1355, 1356. Then gradually moved across northern France and into Italy into Turin, Italy in 1578, because at that point that was the ancient capital of Italy, and it was owned by the Savoy family that was ruling Italy. So it's a very natural place to find it. Matter of fact, if you'd ask the question, well, if the shroud has survived both natural decomposition, which is a very slow process for linen, because it's only by dehydration and oxidation. And there are pieces of cloth that are thousands of years older than the Shroud of Turin. So it's not surprising that it has existed. And so it came into Turin, Italy, and given church history, you would expect to find the burial cloth of Jesus in association, in some sense, with the Catholic Church. And that's where we find it.
Thank you. Yeah, that getting into the history, it seems that the Middle Ages are what people focus on, because it's from there that the history seems the most reliable, where we are able to trace it even through the theft and on its way to Edessa, and as you stated. But as Gary said, there's a lot of markers of this matching the death and the burial of Jesus. You mentioned in your book, The Historical Jesus, you say that the dating of the pollen, as Bob said, the lepton coin of Pontius Pilate placed over the eyes, the Qumran burial practices and the Jewish laws of mourning, the lack of decomposition remains on the cloth, the actual blood stains, which wasn't paint or dye or powder, the body in the state of rigor mortis, the abnormal injuries, the many different punctures in the scalp, the bruised face, the whipping wounds, the abrasions on the shoulders from a heavy object, the contusion. I mean, the list goes on and on. I have a huge list here, and none of these contradict the gospel accounts, which is very interesting. But not only that, it was these abnormal, unique features about it that matched in agreement with Jesus's burial.
But that don't match normal crucifixion.
Right, exactly, but that don't match normal crucifixion, which is key. And the body, and as you said, the body was not unwrapped. That was a very interesting point to me. And is there any new research that you've come across that possibly contradicts any of these theories or these similarities?
No, if you talk to Barry Schwartz, who has become sort of the curator of, he's the one who owns the Shroud.com website. And if you want to see the best thing out there right now, pro and con essays, great photographs. Barry is one of several scientific photographers who went to Turin in 1978. He's Jewish. He's totally convinced the shroud is Jesus. Doesn't think Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, doesn't think the image on the cloth is radiation, but he's open to it. And Barry's one of the scientists that doesn't like the coins argument, so that's not a unanimous argument. One other thing on Jerusalem is the dirt on the bottom of the feet. You've got the pollens, as far as markers. You've got the possibility of the lepton, which is a lepton of Pontius Pilate, 29 to 32 AD. You know, it's really interesting. Here's a couple things. If it really is 29 to 32 AD, that would seem to mark something, that we do historical Jesus things, that would seem to rule out the 33 AD date for the death of Jesus, which is the second most popular date, if the coin is 32 and the death has already taken place. But the dirt on the bottom of the feet is limestone. It's been written up in a peer-reviewed chemical journal that it is limestone almost exclusively found in Jerusalem. It's dirt, quote unquote, but it's limestone. So you've got pollens, dirt, possibility of a coin, all going back to Jerusalem from an artifact that's not known to have left Western Europe. So, there's some. Did you ask me something else to mention there? No, is that it? Okay. Seemed like I was going to say something else, but anyway.
So, despite the numerous similarities, the shroud seems to be a very contentious topic regardless. Why do you think this is?
People don't want to believe in Jesus or his resurrection. They want to live their own lives. They want to be in control of their own lives and do their own ungodly things that they want to do without feeling guilt or condemnation. But the evidence is there. It's convincing. I have no doubt at all that this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, and this gives convincing evidence of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which is the gospel. So that the Shroud of Turin is a visual apologetic for the gospel. And it's convincing to scientists. The people that respond best to the Shroud of Turin is skeptics and scientists.
Why don't you just take a few minutes and talk about your 17 arguments that the image on the shroud is. I think that's one of the most persuasive things Bob does is 17 arguments that the image on the shroud is radiation from a dead body. Now, I mean, we have a lot of burial cloths in existence, so what are dead bodies doing given images on cloth, let alone a dead body that was crucified, let alone a dead body that apparently was crucified that looks like it belongs to Jesus, and what's a dead body given off radiation for? This seems pretty exciting, but he's got a paper, 17 arguments for that radiation, because there is a discussion. I already mentioned Barry Schwartz, who's one of the leading authorities on the shroud. Barry doesn't think it's radiation, but that could be because not everybody wants to try to connect this thing to the resurrection. So,
yeah, actually, could I preface that with a quote by Philip Ball? Because in 2008, in the journal Nature, he wrote, "It is fair to say that despite the seemingly definitive tests in 1988, the status of the Shroud of Turin is murkier than ever." And that was about 10 years ago. And the research that you've been doing with the radiation, it seems to make the argument that this was a fake relic crafted in the Middle Ages. It seems to rise or fall on your research on the radiation. So could you talk about that?
Yes, they're saying that it's murkier than ever because they thought that they had put it into a nice clean box, wrapping it all up as a forgery from the Middle Ages. But the shroud, that work was done in 1988, the carbon-14 dating, the way it was communicated, apparently communicated to the layman that the shroud dated to about 1260 AD. And I can go into a lot of the reasons related to the statistical analysis and how that was a faulty conclusion to draw. But what's the question again?
I was asking what's the latest research that you're doing that seems to rebut that,
okay.
And then as it goes into the 17 arguments that Gary was talking about.
Yes, since the carbon dating done in 1988, the shroud researchers just could not, they said there's something wrong here. They had a difficult time explaining it, but I believe that I've come up with the correct explanation. I should mention here that there's been several different explanations. The very first explanation was neutron absorption on the cloth that would form brand new carbon-14 on the cloth and thus shift the carbon date from about 30 AD to the 1260 date. Unfortunately, no one was able to follow up on that because of the inadequacy of the computers at that time. So there came to be explanations related to just contamination due to handling, or contamination due to something being put onto the shroud, or contamination due to bacteria forming plastic coating on the shroud, or contamination due to the smoke from the fires, or a type of invisible reweave or patch that was done just in that area. And one by one, as these different suggestions were considered and researched, they are gradually falling away. The one that's most current now is the invisible patch or reweave theory. I don't believe that's the correct answer to it. I think that the correct answer is back to the very first suggestion of neutron absorption. This was finally followed up by me as a nuclear engineer. I was running nuclear analysis computer codes, calculations. I used a computer code called MCNP, which is an acronym for Monte Carlo Neutron Particle, and I was using that in my criticality safety work. So I simply applied that computer code and all of the data to model the body of Jesus wrapped in a piece of cloth in a limestone tomb as it would have been designed in first century Israel. And so the concept here was that there was a burst of radiation from within the body, vertically oriented, I thought at that time, vertically oriented radiation, which then formed the two images, and that burst of radiation evidently, according to my hypothesis, included neutrons. And what I found when I did the calculation with neutrons being uniformly emitted from a dead human body in a limestone tomb was that it formed a cosine-shaped distribution in the tomb. Now, I realized that that was the form that would be taken back a year or two after they published the statistical analysis, which they published in 1989. But I sat in the library and reading that, and at that point in my life, I had 19 years experience calculating neutron distributions in nuclear reactors. So I had a pretty good idea how the neutron distribution would calculate out in a tomb. And what I found was that what I believed at that point, just sitting in the library, was that the cosine distribution down where they took the sample was down near the feet. It would be falling off very rapidly. And I looked at the data and I said, that's exactly what the three laboratories measured. They measured a slope to the data of about 36 years per centimeter. In other words, if you move the sample point 1 inch, you would shift the date about 91 years. So if you shifted the sample point 13 inches, that's the difference between 30 AD and 1260 AD.
Yeah.
And so the concept of neutron emission from within the body actually explains the four different things that we know about carbon-14 dating as it relates to the Shroud of Turin. It explains the date, it explains the slope, it explains the range of the data. The invisible reweave theory is contradicted by the range of the data, because that would predict that there should be some of the subsamples that would date to 30 AD, and none did. The fourth thing is very interesting. They believe that they also have the face cloth that John and Peter discovered in the tomb that was removed from the body, set aside before the top cover was put over. It has no image on it because it wasn't on the body at the instant of the resurrection. And according to my calculations, with my computer code on my desktop computer at home, I calculated that the date of what would be the face cloth if the person doing the burial simply was right-handed and simply placed it down on the side bench, just even with the body, would date to 700 AD. And that's exactly the date that the Sudarium of Oviedo dated to. Oviedo is a small town in northern Spain. Sudarium is the Greek word for face cloth. So they believe historically that's fairly well founded, that is the face cloth that was found by Peter and John in the tomb.
Wow, that's really interesting information, and that gives a very good explanation of all the details and the data that you find there. Something that struck me as I was doing the research was the inexplicability for us to account for all this data. I mean, the explanatory power of your hypothesis versus the explanatory power of these other hypotheses. I mean, we have, as I was going through, there was John Jackson, his theory of the cloth falling through a mechanically transparent body, Frank Tipler's Sphalerion quantum tunneling, the corona discharge theory, I mean, there's a lot of these crazy theories. I mean, that they're getting into, quantum mechanics, trying to explain how you can account for the radiation leaving a scorch burn on the cloth, and while keeping the cloth intact and all that. Gary, do you see any of these hypotheses matching up at all, or even having any persuasive in your eyes? Or what would be the best argument that you've seen from opponents of Bob's view?
The number one comeback. Yeah. By the way, I remembered when I gave the mic up, but I was going to say that last thing you mentioned to me about the cloth was not unwrapped.
Right.
when Ken Stevenson and Ken was the editor and spokesperson for the 78 investigation. He was in Turin. And a little history here. I just finished my PhD dissertation on the resurrection, and I had been interested in the Shroud for about 10 years at that point because I read a really intriguing book that just looked like it couldn't be refuted. And so I called Eric Jumper, who was one of the two names most, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, they were in a carpool together. John Jackson, Eric Jumper, D. German, and Ken Stevenson, my co-author. D, by the way, the other two guys were Orthodox Catholics, and D. German was an agnostic, and Ken was Catholic, but had become Baptist as it is today. He's a charismatic pastor. But they were in a carpool together, and they were talking about these theories. That's, by the way, where the famous VP8 image analyzer photograph of the Shroud, the green one here behind Bob, is one of the 3D photos, which to me, I would have said was the number one most difficult thing to explain about the Shroud naturally until the teeth and the radiation thing came out, which I think is probably the number one most difficult thing to explain now, and the 3Ds moved to number two, and the superficiality, which is this the two upper photos there, how the image, you can look at this later, the image fibers there are these shiny fibers. Larry Schwalbe, one of the physicists on the team, told me that each thread was probably made up of like 200 fibrils, and the Shroud image is only in the top fibril or two. It doesn't even go through a fibril, let alone through a thread. So anyway, so when we brought our first book out in 1981, Verdict on the Shroud, Larry Schwalbe, who's an agnostic, Larry wrote the foreword for the book, and Robert Buckland, who was the L.A. County coroner, he was MD, JD, and for L.A. County. He was one of the guys who was interviewed, by the way, for the old Quincy program, which is kind of a forerunner to CSI and some of those programs today. And it's Bob who wrote the postscript for our first book, and he's the one who said that the Shroud was not unwrapped because the blood stains were not disturbed. So if you're peeling a linen cloth off a body with wounds and blood all over it, you're going to chip the blood's going to go with it. The dry blood's going to be all over the floor, when you have that many wounds. Pardon?
The blood clots, too, you mentioned.
From the whipping and everything else. But Bob said they pretty much there was agreement that the stains were intact. So we came up with three arguments. The body was wrapped. The body was not unwrapped. The body disappears from the cloth. And there's no paint, dye, powder, or any foreign substance on the cloth that can account for the image area. So that unwrapping thing came from Bob Buckland, which is a pretty authoritative source. He was the chief pathologist for the team that did the investigation. Now, did you ask me something else there, too?
Yeah, and what's the best theory that could account for any of these naturalistically?
Probably the one that Barry holds, Barry Schwartz. And that's a theory that's evolved a little bit over the years, but it started out years ago as we called it the Pella-Quarry German hypothesis back in the day. Sam Pella-Quarry was a physicist with the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, and D. German was in the original carpool. Those four guys were professors at the Air Force Academy in mechanical and physics fields. And it's the theory that if you put on the cloth certain body type chemicals like ammonia, things like that, sweat, what comes from sweat and blood, and you put it in an oven to I don't know how you're going to duplicate this, but they try to duplicate aging by putting it in an oven and seeing if they could get an image. Because one of the biggest problems is how do you get an image that is directionally, Bob referred to it, that is directionally, we can't reproduce the image today. You can make something that looks like a shroud, but it's not going to be the shroud. And as John Heller, one of the leading researchers, Yale biochemist from years ago, John Heller said, the problem is the physics contradicts the chemistry and the chemistry contradicts the physics. So you can't put the theories together. It's a real enigma. And so probably what we called the Pella Quarry German hypothesis in the old days is probably the number one. Over time, these chemicals on the shroud do da-da-da-da-da, and they, I'm sure Bob's got some things to say about this. It's probably the major competitive theory to what makes. It's very difficult because it doesn't seem like you would get image-only fibrils from a view like this would be one major comeback. Also, all the measurements seem like the image on the shroud is radiation, not baking or baking chemicals or something like that. Bob, you probably want to, I'm sure, address that.
All the evidence contradicts it. So how do you believe it is the problem. Under that theory, you would have side images. You don't have side images. Okay? They're just very simple. It contradicts the evidence. So there's two approaches that I see people taking. One approach is to start with a philosophical assumption of naturalism. And then you can simply, if you don't like the data, you simply ignore it. That's not my approach. Okay? I don't think that's scientifically accurate. It's not reasonable. What you need to do here is to restrain the temptation to make a presupposition of naturalism, because that's a restriction that prevents you from a proper explanation. What you need to do, the approach needs to be to take the data as you find it, each individual piece of scientific data, and understand what that data is telling you. You have to read the data on the shroud and not allow presuppositions of naturalism to restrict the direction that the data leads you. And that's a crucial distinction. People that object to what I'm saying, they invariably make that mistake as to how to approach the subject. So that there's so many contradictions to every other theory, and that is why the major shroud researchers agree that the cause of this image is radiation. For example, I organized a 4-day conference on the Shroud of Turin that was held this last July up in Pasco, Washington. We had 28 top researchers from Italy, Spain, France, Mexico, Australia, and the United States come to the conference, and we produced 34 hours of PowerPoint presentations and panel discussions, all on the Shroud of Turin. It's on my website, shroudresearch.com. Go over to the conference 2017 page. All that information is there with the videos that we produced at the time. My papers, 9 papers on the internet, are over on the research page on that website, shroudresearch.net. But there's so many contradictions to other concepts here. In the conference that I put on, the last day was dedicated to image formation, and the 10 speakers on that day, they all approached the subject of image formation from the perspective of radiation. So there's a general consensus that radiation is the correct answer, because that's where the data itself leads you.
And the radiation, I think, it's important to keep in mind that is key when you're talking about the best argument against this entire hypothesis is that it was a relic of the Middle Ages, because it's inexplicable how it would come about now, but especially back in the Middle Ages.
Could I show this?
Yeah.
I carry this in my wallet. The carbon dating, the raw value was 1260. They then went through a correction process to give a range of 1260 to 1390, but the raw value was 1260. This is an authentic Byzantine coin. Mm-hmm. It has on here, if you can look at it, this is the same image as the Shroud of Turin. Wow, is right. Same image as the Shroud of Turin. Backside says, Jesus Christ, King of Kings. This was a coin that you go down to the store and buy bread in Constantinople in 1025 to 1028 is when this was minted.
Wow.
And I carry this in my wallet for this purpose. This is...
Buy bread, right?
Yes, to buy bread, yes.
Get a donut maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so this was just normal money in Constantinople at the time because it was so famous at that point.
Yeah.
You know, everyone knew about it. Every Friday they would raise it up and show it in one of the main churches there. But the point being here is that this was minted 235 years before carbon-14 dating. Now the range of 1260 to 1390 was already 2 sigma, and this is a further 7 sigma. So in statistical analysis terminology, we're now 9 sigma off of the date, and that will not happen by random chance. So that this coin that I carry in my pocket not only disproves the carbon dating, but it raises the very serious question: how can carbon dating be so wrong? And so that carbon dating, instead of disproving the authenticity of the shroud, that whole argument is now turned on its head and becomes one of the main arguments for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, because this, the difference between this coin and the 1260 date can only be explained by a neutron absorption on the shroud, which takes an event which I say is outside of our normal understanding of the laws of physics.
Bob's got this coin here. Now, I've not seen this one before, but you know the one, oh, thank you. I'm going to go buy some bread. How many points of overlap is there between this and the shroud face? I can't, without putting my glasses on, I can't.
Good. Yeah, there's a lot.
Sure there's many.
Can you see the lines on the neck or the,
I think, yes, and the different lengths.
how about the triangle between the eyes?
It shows a full frontal face, shows the long nose, shows the hair parted in the middle, the hair coming down on one side, longer than the other. It does show the line coming across.
It does have the line across the throat? That's a biggie to me.
Yes, it's entered in as part of the fabric of...
It is. It's ancient because on the photo, the blood runs along that wrinkle on the neck. Well, okay, now this one is what date?
1025 to 1028.
Okay, now there are also the gold coins, Solidus, and the other ones from 692 to what is it, 692 to 710?
Yeah, if you wanted to buy one for me, I would allow you to.
How much are they going for these days? Well,
It was purchased off eBay, believe it or not.
really, this is really cool. Do you guys understand the art history argument? He's not saying that because somebody put an image that's got to be the shroud image because there's so many similarities in dissimilar areas, that therefore it's Jesus. No, the fact that an artist thought it was Jesus doesn't prove it's Jesus. The point is that if an artist is using this 350 years before the presumed dating, the dating is wrong. If someone's got the shroud there. The carbon date is wrong. Now you have another one. I'd like to look at that later, put my glasses on and look at it. But there's some gold coins that are available in little different sizes. They're very, very teeny. And I've seen these too, you know, in the actual coins that have been tracked down and purchased. But the comment, I don't know how good this is in detective speak, but 40 to 70 points supposedly of congruity. Let's say you rob a 7-Eleven store and nobody knows really who you are except there's a high school picture of you. And is the high school picture the picture that's on the film from the 7-Eleven of a guy who's 21? Is it the same person? And if you want to make the case in court, you need 40 to 70 points of congruity. And there are anywhere up to 200 points of congruity between these gold coins, which also say King of Kings and Lord of Lords. They're the very first ones, I think, of the Roman Empire to have the face of Jesus on them. But the similarities are incredible. For example, on the shroud, there's this wrinkle we're talking about. There's a double wrinkle down about here. And it's ancient because in the color photos, you can see the blood moving, the enhanced photos, the blood moves along these wrinkles. And people think that the beard, behind Bob here, people think the beard is the white, the part there, don't forget left, right, light, darkness, reversal. It looks like the, if I can have you hold it. It looks like the beard is right here. And it looks like a typical beard today with maybe like a little indentation and 2 points on it. And it's off center. Here's the center of the face. And the beard, depending on photos, you know, you have this right-left thing that you have to get used to on Shroud photos. But it's a little off center. And so people think Jesus had one of these kind of cool, 21st century goatees that have the little, but he doesn't. The beard goes all the way down to here. As you can see in the 3D photos, the beard goes all the way down, and the wrinkles are at the bottom of this. Okay, so that's the bottom of the beard. Now, several things here. So if you have gold coins from 690 to 710 AD, and they have up to 200 points of congruence between the shroud image and the coin, guess what? Doesn't prove the shroud is Jesus's, but it shows that somebody thought the shroud was Jesus's. But here's the main point. If you're painting the shroud in 690 to 710, and you're putting the images on the coins later, it's not 1360 carbon 14 dating. There's something wrong with it. And the best example is a wax on, I'm not an artistic type person, but a famous, what's it called, the pentacrator?
Pentacrator right behind you.
Oh, right here. Yes, excellent.
Let's get this.
This is one of the most famous pictures of Jesus in history. Let me give you this one back. I'll trade you for this one. Here.
Okay.
This is a wax, not exactly a painting. Notice the short beard. Now, it doesn't do the double-peaked one, but this is the interpretation of the short beard. The beard goes down to here, and here's these mysterious lines. Why, when you're painting Jesus, do you put a line across the neck in the middle of nowhere? And where's the line go? Nowhere. Where's the stop? Right here. Where's the stop on the other side? Right here. Why do you do it? Well, I don't know. There's a line there. And if you look, there's a triangle between the eyes. Well, there's a triangle between the eyes of the man in the shroud. And there's a debate about what it's there for. Is it a watermark? Is it a... There's different discussions. But there's this mysterious, why would a guy have a triangle between his eyes? Why would there be two lines down here? Well, in the coin, and I haven't seen your coin, but you said it's in your coin. It's in the gold coins. These two lines, the triangle between the eyes, and like Bob was saying, notice the hair on the right goes behind the shoulder. The hair on the left goes straight down. That's exactly the way it is in the coins. Now this painting, well, it's not a painting, but this goes all the way back to the 6th century, is it? 500s AD. 500s. There's just too many things here to correspond to the resurrection of Jesus. Here's the key. Too many things to correspond in abnormal areas. Why the lines on the neck? Why do you put a triangle between the eyes? Well, because the shroud has it, and that's Jesus. Oh, it is, huh? Okay. Well, he sure was convinced of that. But this thing dates from the 500s. So you're telling me the shroud is 1360? You got a problem here. So that's just so you understand the intent of the art history argument. It's that they had an object there that was obviously the shroud. There's too many similarities and dissimilar areas. Up to 200. And the different coins have different lineups of how many points are congruity. But if you look at those little gold coins that you can see photos of, they're just, you look at it, you go, oh, the shroud. I mean, it looks like a spitting image. But 500s, 690, 710, 10, what again?
1025.
1025. The shroud was around way before the carbon-14. So that's the point of the argument.
Yeah, so it not only disproves the carbon-14 dating, but it raises the very serious question, how could the carbon dating be so wrong? Scientifically, you have to explain that in some way. The only way to explain that is by neutron absorption on the cloth, which means that there was a burst of radiation from somewhere. The other argument, now, just for example, as we're looking at each other here, you can see me, I can see you, but my image is being perceived by you consciously across a distance. That's amazing when you stop to think about it. How does that happen? Well, it's because light is being emitted from the lights. The smallest packet of light energy is called a photon. So these are photon emitters. So that all the photons are flooding the room from the lights and from the light coming in through the windows. All those photons are bouncing off of us in all directions, carrying the information content that defines my appearance to your eyes. That information content that defines my appearance is carried on those photons in the energy, the intensity, and the direction that they go through your lens. That information content, the energy communicates the color. The intensity communicates the shade, light versus dark. And the angle, as those photons go through the lens of your eye, communicates position. So that a photon coming from right here on my sleeve will be communicating the color, the intensity, and the position of that color. And that's then all focused down on the rods and cones on the back of your eyes, so that that information content that is communicated to you about my appearance is then translated into electrical signals that travel up your optic nerve to give you a conscious awareness of what I look like. That's what's going on. And that's the same thing applies to the Shroud of Turin. That is how this image was formed. In other words, there was a discoloration mechanism, there must have been, to discolor the fibers on just the top 1 or 2 layers of fibers on each thread. And so that discoloration mechanism, we haven't completely defined that yet. I think it was an electrostatic emission. For example, the fibers would have been something like this, and it's just the very top part of those fibers that is discolored like a lightning rod. I see it as a lightning rod effect. Like a thundercloud goes over, you have lightning hitting the tip of the lightning rod. That's what we have here. The top part of the fibers, I think, would be going through what's often called a corona discharge, which is a type of a static discharge, but that would be induced by radiation. So I think those concepts are very consistent. But it would be the radiation that would be providing 2 necessary things to the discoloration mechanism. And that would be the discoloration mechanism it's absolutely required that energy provided to drive it and information be provided to control it, so that the discoloration mechanism will discolor one fiber, but not the fiber right next to it, and control the length of the discoloration over the length of the fiber that is discolored, so that you end up with energy and information, both of those being carried from the body to the cloth to bring about this image. There is an absolute requirement for that information content to flow from the body to the cloth. There's no way around it. And so that's why it's absolutely certain in my mind that you do have a burst of radiation being emitted from the body, and no human body, natural human body that we're aware of, has ever done that, yet we have an example of it. So therefore, if it has happened, it is possible.
Here's some close-ups of the threads. This is a blood stain. This goes through the cloth. This is an image stain. If you come up and look afterwards, look at the silver shiny threads. These are image threads. And you can see it's a fibril. This is the thread. These are fibrils on the thread. So if Larry Schwalbe, if you think of a thread as having 200-ish fibrils, these images are in the top fibers only. But you're looking at this is a close-up of the image. That's a close-up of the blood.
Yeah. And this is where the image is the strongest, on the tip of the nose. Believe it or not.
This photo, you mean, is from the tip of the nose? There's a lot of these out. These are called photomicrographs. And when Ken Stevenson and I used to give lectures together, my co-author, he would say that these were his favorite photos, are photomicrographs. When I first started lecturing the Shroud, I would say, if this is the Shroud of Jesus, if this is a blood stain, if it's the Shroud of Jesus, this is a close-up of Jesus' blood. You should have seen you've probably seen it. You've probably seen the faces of the people in the crowd when they consider this could be the blood of Jesus. Well, I quit saying it. I left that out of my lectures because it was like total realization that this could be, salvation, the means of salvation. This to me is more evidential and more exciting because we're talking about a close-up of what Bob's been describing here, his area of specialization, the radiation. You're looking at a close-up of the radiation image. So his arguments on it can only be explained by radiation. And the comebacks from the naturalists are super, super lame. Like, they quit doing it. Now, you're more up on the latest than I am, but Joe Nickel in the old days, Ken Stevenson is from Pittsburgh, and he went into a Pittsburgh radio station to give a lecture one night. He was invited to come into the studio to do an interview. And he got in there, and Joe Nickel was in the studio, who's the most famous debunker of the Shroud. He's part of this group with the Humanist Manifesto and Prometheus Publishers, and he was an art guy. And he claimed, and this is fair, but his versions went through. He'd say, well, I've proven that, and I've proven that, but you have to go back, and there's this version of Joe Nickel, this version of Joe Nickel. That's fine. People can make different images. But Ken there he is in the studio. But the main problem with the painting theory at that time is, like I already said, there's no paint, dye, powder, or any foreign substance on the image that can account for the image. The image is not caused by things on the cloth. The image is caused by what you're seeing, this close-up of whatever marked those the shroud threads, the fibrils, looking like like having the appearance of radiation. But I don't know what the latest is outside of what we used to call the Pella Quarry German hypothesis. Outside of that, in the version that Barry Schwartz holds today, I don't know any takers, and I don't know how that theory measures up. You said it's very inferior and scientifically. One other thing, and I'd like to hear him talk about Barry's theory compared to the radiation theory, but one other thing on radiation here, on the image, is that the views that critics have to come up with are generally things being put onto it or vapor graphs coming from the body. That's a real old one, go back 1930s. Vapor graphs, but vapor graphs smudge, and the fact that the image is 3D, what's so hard about the green photo there, the shroud image measures cloth to body distance. This is the readout from the VP8 image analyzer. There are no 3D photos today per se, but when they took a photo of the shroud face, put it in the VP8 image analyzer, it came out like you were looking at, it looks like an eerie face looking at you. But if you took a picture of your face and put it in the VP8 image analyzer, Joe Nickel would take photos of his faked ones, and he made the mistake of sending them in to the scientists. And they ran them through the VP8 image analyzer. The nose would be like sunken into the face. The eyes would be bugging out. Everything would be off. You'd say, it's not a human face. It's like Halloween. But it would not look anything like this. So there's no 3D coded data. What 3D means is there's cloth to body distance. So if the cloth is draped over the body, it's going to touch the high points, right? It's going to touch your forehead, your nose, your chin. It's not going to get your ears. It's going to touch the arm going across the front, and the left arm in particular, because the left arm's over the right arm, it's not going to get the rib cage. It's going to get the left knee that's popped back up like this, not the right knee that's down below it. But on the image, these things are there. So how do these things get on the cloth when the cloth's not touching those areas? So whatever it is has to jump across a distance, and that's where the radiation comes in. But the critics have just, to my knowledge, they're done coming up with the theories, and they just say, well, you guys, you're just a bunch of religious blah, 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 and you don't believe carbon-14. You're just typical. You're just like young earthers or something. You just distrust carbon-14 no matter what. That's just your prejudice. Well, how do you answer the coin objection? How do you answer the objection from a 6th century image of Jesus' face that was obviously taken from the shroud because of triangles and lines and the hair exactly the same way coming behind the shoulder, in front of the shoulder. How do you explain all that? These guys thought they were doing Jesus. You have this one, you got the gold coins, you've got, I've never seen one of these bronze ones, but you've got Bob's coin. These all predate the shroud by anywhere from what would that be, 800 years, all the way up to the newest one, which is still, would you say 350, right? About 350 from the shroud. If the shroud's around in those years, the carbon-14 is just wrong. That's all you got to know. You don't have to do a scientific analysis. Oh, yeah, it's you guys. You guys are always doing the scientific analysis and carbon-14 is wrong. No, just explain the paintings. Just explain the fact that people had the shroud there 800 years before the carbon-14.
Yes, there's 12 different ways to date the Shroud of Turin that are consistent with the 1st century. There's only one dating mechanism that is inconsistent with the 1st century, and that is carbon-14 dating. Now, when they did the carbon-14 dating, in 1988, they then published the data, at least most of it, in a sense, and then did a statistical analysis on that data. I'm sorry, but there was significant problems with their statistical analysis that I think resulted from a presupposition that they already knew the answer before they started. And the answer that they knew to be the case was that it was a forgery from the Middle Ages because it was shown in Lorraine, France in 1355 or 56. But when I take the same data, and not only their data, but actually the data behind what they published, the 16 values rather than the 12 values that they actually published, and that you can then do a statistical analysis to determine the probability that the average values from the 3 different laboratories, Tucson, Zurich, and Oxford, to determine whether the average values from those 3 different laboratories is consistent with the stated measurement uncertainty. And that analysis is called a chi-squared statistical analysis. When I do that analysis, the answer that I come out with is that the probability that the average values from the 3 laboratories is consistent with the measurement uncertainties is 1.4%. In other words, there's a 98.6% probability that the data is wrong. It's inconsistent with the measurement data. The way that they got around that in the analysis was that they just assumed that the measurement data was understated. But you'd have to understate it by a factor of 3 to get anything reasonable. But the point, one of the main points is that the measurement uncertainties were determined using the same equipment and the same procedures. So if you just assume away the uncertainties, why not just assume away the measurements as well? It'd be just as legitimate to assume away the measurements.
Bob, I've got a question for you. So you've got these pre-shroud artistic obvious data. Like I said, you don't put lines across them. By the way, some people say, once in a while when I'm doing lectures, say, how do you know the shroud didn't copy off the paintings? But you got to think about it. If you start doing the paintings, you don't have a shroud. Why do you put 2 lines across the throat that do nothing, go nowhere? Why do you put a triangle between? I think I'm going to put a triangle between these eyes. I always like putting triangles on the faces of dead people. You know, it's like, just how do you explain these things? And things that are very abnormal in the paintings. But those to me are the 2 best, the triangle and the lines. By the way, that reminds me, I wanted to say this before. Some people want to know, what about a face cloth? John says there was a face cloth. The Greek, there's face cloths only mentioned twice. Lazarus and Jesus. And both times it says, now this is one thing I have about Oviedo. I don't have a view on the face cloth in Oviedo. The blood type's the same. The blood stains line up with the shroud face and so on. But the verses in the Greek say that the cloth was wound up and tied around the face. One text says around the face, one says around the head. If you think of the old cartoons or Three Stooges, when somebody has a toothache, they would put a cloth around their head and tie it on the top, and they're walking around. Well, the Mishnah commentary in the Old Testament, Jewish commentary, commands that the jaw be bound up, because in a state of rigor mortis, the jaw often pops open, and they would tie it shut, and it would say around the head. Well, in the 3D pictures here, this is probably the best one over here, or the 3D one would be great. Notice if the beard goes down to here, notice how something is drawing the beard in. And there's a gap between the hair and the face. There's gaps on each side, and something's pulling the hair back, so that when you see this little thing that I said looks like a modern goatee, it actually is apparently the hair that popped out from tying the beard down. So if you tie this long beard down, this is the stuff that comes out. And the hair, something's keeping the hair. The hair looks like a kind of a waterfall. You comb your hair out, then you would hairspray it, so that the hair would come out like this and stop like a waterfall that's frozen. But something's in between there. So I don't know if you have responses to some of those things. I wonder, the question I wanted to ask you was, have you heard of the, you were with Tom DiMahala last week, who was the president of the Shroud team back in the day. Tom's a PhD in physics. And have you done anything with the alternative datings of the Shroud that put it in the first century? Have you asked Tom and those guys? I've talked to Eric Jumper, John Jackson, Tom DiMahala, the who's who of Shroud research. But have you asked them about the Shroud dates, the 30 AD, the 70 AD dates?
I've not. No.
Well, it's always off record, but Ken and I got tired of people doing the 1360 and not doing the earlier one. But they had an unauthorized test of the Shroud because there were threads around. And they took it to Caltech. I'm not sure. It was at one of the California major Cal universities. And they dated 2 ends of a thread. Now, this is from memory, but as I recall, the 2 ends of the thread were 70 AD and 30 AD. Then I heard another one that was about 200 date. But the guy who did the dating said he didn't trust the later date because there was some junk on the Shroud that he couldn't get off. And you're not careful, you date the impurities instead of the cloth. But I just wonder if you had any. The guys will say, yeah, we got the dates, but it wasn't with the proper scientific protocol. We didn't announce that ahead of time. Well, heck, the thing they did for 1360 was without scientific protocols. In fact, we have a whole chapter, Ken and I. Ken was an engineer, my co-author, and he had a whole chapter on the protocols that they didn't use in the main scientific dating. So I don't know why the guys are saying the earlier first century datings didn't have protocol, because the big ones didn't either. But I just wonder if you had any response to the first century dates that they did get with the rogue threads that they dated.
Yes, I'm just not sure that they were dated adequately. And so I've not really put too much consideration to them. There were, when I say that there's 12 different dating mechanisms that date it consistent with the first century, I'm not even including that.
I mean, that alone would refute the dating if it were a good test.
Yes, the proper statistical analysis of the data that they provide also disproves their conclusion. Their conclusion is not justified by the data that they give.
You folks understand what he's saying? The graphical data on the 1360 date does not match the date that they publish. So their background data contradicts. Is that fair? It contradicts the actual date. Also, any thoughts about the Italian laser? The Italian universities have done further dating, have gotten plus or minus 250 and all that kind of stuff, the later dating, which is also early and not late. Nothing's up to 1400 like that one test.
That's exactly right. That's a reference to work that's has been done by Giulio Fonti in Italy, and I think he's spending full time on doing research on the Shroud of Turin. But he developed 3 different techniques to date linen as it ages. Now, two of those techniques were related to how light is reflected off of linen as it ages. The other technique is a tensile strength dating technique, which is related to how much force you have to put on a linen thread to break it. And when they tried to do those tests on the Shroud of Turin and then average the results of those three different dating mechanisms, they came out with, I think it was about 35 BC plus or minus 250 years, so that the uncertainty range was large, but it was consistent with the first century and contradicted the Middle Ages. That's just one out of the 12. One of the other dating mechanisms that I liked was that there is, over on this side, you can see that there's a seam that runs the entire length of the shroud that sews the side piece onto the main section of the shroud. Evidently, what was done there was that in the manufacturing of the shroud originally, that piece was cut off and then it was folded over itself and sewn back on in the manufacturing process, possibly in some way due to culture. A cultural requirement to do that. Not exactly clear why. And that the two ends here and here then broke off because that's where they would hold it to display it. But the stitch on that seam was a unique stitch according to modern day experts on fabrics. It was a professionally done unique stitch. They finally did find a stitch that was rather similar to it, and they found it on a piece of cloth from Masada, which was destroyed in 73 to 74 AD. That dating technique dates the Shroud of Turin to the 1st century.
So to summarize, from the art history argument, which says that from the Middle Ages, arose many. It must be stated that there's a lot of relics that were falsely created in the Middle Ages because there was a lot of superstition at the time. So that it seems to be a good argument. But from what both of you were saying, the radiation, the archaeological evidence from the art itself back before the Middle Ages, and the carbon dating all counteract. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
For the one date,
yes.
1360 is the only outlying piece of data. Everything else points to the earlier period.
Yes, and now with this new approach, we turn that argument on its head, and that becomes one of the best evidences. That is, the carbon dating to 1260 to be so wrong is an additional support. It's only explained by neutron absorption, which requires an emission of radiation from the body. So we turn that argument on its head.
If you folks all understood what he said about the neutron absorption, this was first done by Phillips, right, of Harvard. Yeah, Harvard physicist who said, what happens if this process emits the neutron flux, the shroud could potentially, this is one possibility, it could date 1360 a bunch of times. It could, if the neutrons make it younger than it really is. It makes the cloth younger, the release from the radiation, right?
Yes, Tom Phillips made that suggestion actually in a letter to the editor in the same issue of the British journal Nature that the statistical analysis was published in on the data that was measured. Okay.
We have no confirmation of the neutron flux except for just figures, right?
Yeah, the neutron flux hypothesis, and I call it a hypothesis, is the only hypothesis that explains all four things that we know about carbon dating and is consistent with a burst of radiation coming from the body.
Even the burst language, when the Shroud stuff first came out, and I called Eric Jumper in 1978, was it? And it was funny because Eric is a kind of a suspicious sounding person by nature anyway. And they weren't supposed to talk to anybody in the press until the scientific results came out. And I signed the same 3-page run-on lawyer-driven sentence that the other guys signed that said they wouldn't talk until October 12th, whatever it was, of 1981, fall of 81. So anyway, I'm talking to Eric on the phone, and he says, he said, "And why are you calling?" I said, "Well, I just finished my PhD dissertation at Michigan State on the resurrection, and I'm interested if there's any evidence here for the resurrection." He said, "Well, we don't talk to reporters." And I said, "I'm not a reporter. I just did my PhD." He said, "Well, you sure sound like a reporter." Well, I'm sorry, just because I ask questions. He goes, "The guy you need to talk to, the guy who will talk to you, a lot of the scientists won't, but our editor will, editor and spokesperson in the carpool." He said, "Ken will talk to you." And that night he gave me Ken's name. I called Ken on the phone, and our first phone call was 2 to 3 hours long. And Ken, at the end of that first phone call, we didn't know each other from Adam, and Ken said to me, "Hey, you say you're doing a thing right now on the Shroud, right? You're doing kind of a lay level book." He said, "How'd you do this together?" I thought, well, wow, that gets me onto the bottom floor with these guys. I said, "Sure." And about a few months later, I flew down to, he was living that time in New Orleans, and I walked in his front door, turned left to go into his living room, and there was this, he had the 6-foot tall image readout from the VP8 image analyzer. What you're seeing is a face right there is part of a 6-foot cardboard. It's not a piece of art. It's the readout from the photo and that image. So some of these things were just exciting. One last thing, and I'll give it back to Bob here. I'm sure we keep thinking of things. I told you in the original carpool there were 2 Orthodox Catholics, Ken, who was Catholic, became Protestant, and D. German, who was an agnostic. Dee's wife, if I remember the story, Dee's wife was a Christian, and she had been praying for him for a long time. And by the time we wrote our second book, which was 1990, The Shroud of the Controversy, because the carbon-14 had just come out, and we were giving these responses, D. German had just become a Christian. And he, again, is this what we used to call the German Pella Quarry alternative hypothesis. And when Ken interviewed D for our second book, D made this really cool comment. He said, "People ask me if I became a Christian by believing in the Shroud." He said, "I didn't become a Christian by believing in the Shroud. I became a Christian by believing in the man buried in the Shroud." It was a really neat distinction. That it's recorded. His testimony's in our second book called The Shroud and the Controversy.
Did you want to say something?
I always want to say something. Yes, thank you. I want to make it clear here that when I'm talking about a burst of radiation from the body, specifically what radiation is involved. Now, realize that a human body is made up of organs, which is made up of tissue, which is made up of organic compounds, which are made of proteins, which are made of atoms, which are made of electrons, protons, and neutrons. So you've probably never calculated how many neutrons are in your body. I bet you never have. But I did for a 170-pound body. That's the estimated weight of the man of the Shroud. 170 pounds. So I calculated the number of neutrons that would be in such a body. 2 times 10 to the 28th. That's 2 followed by 28 zeros. That's a pretty big number. I then, being a nuclear engineer, running the nuclear analysis computer calculations, I then calculated how many neutrons would have to be emitted from the body in order to shift the date from the carbon-14 sample from 30 AD to 1260 AD. The answer that I came up with was 2 times 10 to the 18th. Now, that's 2 followed by 18 zeros. And you might think, well, that's a huge number. But in comparison to the number that are in the body, it's only 1 neutron per 10 billion that are in the body would have to be released by the body, to free them up to go bouncing around inside the tomb, and that would shift the carbon-14 date. Now, the distribution of those neutrons is what I knew instinctively based upon my experience. It would be a cosine-shaped distribution inside the tomb, and so where they took the sample down near the feet would be down near the very low end of that cosine distribution, but up near the peak of that distribution, that would be up about here on the back side of the body, underneath the backbone, underneath the center of the body mass. The date, if we could get a sample right about there, my computer code calculates that predicts that that would date to about 8,500 AD, way into the future. No, the date predicted by the computer calculations for the elbows, and we're trying to get this material that was removed in 2002 from underneath these patches. They refurbished the shroud in 2002, removed those patches, broke off some of the carbonized material, put it into glass sample jars, and it's been sitting in the vault in Turin, Italy since 2002, and the Italian researchers have been wondering what to do with it. So I put in a proposal last year, going to put it in again this year, to take some of that fully carbonized linen, do carbon dating on it. The prediction is that on the side next to the wall would date to about 4,500 AD, away from the wall would date to about 3,500 AD. Every point on the shroud would date to a different value because of the neutron distribution in that nanosecond when the neutrons were emitted, bounced around, and were absorbed mostly in the limestone. You'd have about 1 in a million being absorbed actually on the shroud, and the mechanism would be that if you take a nitrogen-14 atom, trace amounts of nitrogen-14 are on the shroud, would absorb a neutron, immediately release a proton, and then become a brand new carbon-14 atom. That's the mechanism by which new carbon-14 is created on the Shroud of Turin to skew the date from the true date of 30 AD to an apparent date of 1260 AD. There's lots of neutrons in the body to accomplish that. You'd only need to have a release of 1 in 10 billion from the body to accomplish that.
Bob, another question. When I was talking to Eric back in those days, and he told me, turn me over to Ken, and we ended up doing our book. In those days, the scientists would not use the word burst. And when people interviewed them, they'd say, what's this burst of radiation? And they would say, we don't like the burst of radiation. We don't like burst language. But today, it seems to be fairly common. I wondered if you had a contrast between 78 and after the 78 investigation and today on the word burst.
Yes, no one, a lot of people don't like the word burst because they approach this with a presupposition of naturalism. I think that's basically the root cause, rather than starting with the data and following the data where it leads. If you start with the idea, I'm going to follow the data where it leads, then it leads toward a burst. Now, to explain this image, you have to explain the characteristics of the image. Makes sense. What are the characteristics of the image? Well, first of all, that we have two aspects of this image. There's the blood and there's the discolored fibers. Somehow, now the blood has been a real problem. So over the first probably 70 years of research, 60 or 70 years of research, they were primarily working on the blood. How do you get the blood, which would have been dried on the body? It's not on the body now. How do you get dried blood off the body and onto the cloth? If you take dried blood, it won't soak up into a piece of cloth or tissue or anything. It'll stay on the body. You have to scrub it off to get blood off your body. How did it get onto the cloth? The radiation hypothesis can actually explain that as well. Photons carry momentum. If you have a momentum transfer in a burst of extremely intense burst over an extremely short time span, a nanosecond or less, you can transfer that momentum to the blood that's on the surface of the body, thrust it off of the body, accelerate it across the gap in order to thrust it onto and into the cloth, which is what we have now. And the evidence is that when it arrived on the cloth, it was in a liquid state. It would be dried on the body, but it arrives on the cloth on the liquid state, because it then absorbs so that you can see the serum ring extending out beyond the reddish color. You can see that under ultraviolet light. Can't be reproduced with a forger or an artist. That's what they concluded, so that this had to wrap a actual crucified man. So that the radiation concept explains how the blood gets from the body to the cloth. It also explains in many different senses. I wrote a paper, probably the best one that's been responded to on the internet. The title is Role of Radiation in Image Formation on the Shroud of Turin. You can look that up. It's on my website, shroudresearch.net, on the research page. You go down that page, all the abstracts are given there, and then you can download it from that location.
Is it on Barry's site too?
I believe it is.
On Barry, Shroud.com is the best repository of pros and cons and photos, and it's fantastic. Hey, I'm a little leery. I have any idea how long are we going?
Yeah, we're going to go till 10:30, but we want to give some time for questions.
Sure. I just want to say something now so that when we get to the end of our time, I'm not sitting here and I thought, darn, I forgot to say this thing, so maybe I'll just say it a little bit early. Bob's a guy who's done as much as anybody on the radiation, and you folks who followed my work around here, and Ben Shaw's he's a PhD candidate here, and he's doing dissertation on the resurrection. He's already done an MA thesis on the resurrection. We work on historical aspects. I mean, yeah, I've got 2 co-authored books on the Shroud, and the Shroud's a real interest of mine, but it's not my primary is historical evidence for the resurrection. My comment would be for you just to kind of increase your interest in this last picture, or really any of these, but the last one here. Bob, I asked you on the phone the first time we talked at the end of the phone call, maybe you could respond. What do you think the chances are that that's Jesus underneath the cloth? And what do you think the chances are that what we're looking at is it fair to call it a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus? I mean, I know this is like, wow, I never thought of it that way, but it's a stunning thought. Ian Wilson's book that came out in 1978, one of the first major works on the Shroud, the book ends by saying the Shroud could be a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus. But whatever extent we could call radiation a photograph, that's a picture of something. In your mind, what are the chances that this is Jesus, and what are the chances that we're looking at a picture or a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus?
In my opinion, it's absolutely certain. There's no doubt. The reason being that this requires a burst of radiation to produce this image, to carry the energy and the information content that's necessary, absolutely necessary, to form this image. Every image you see, whether just looking out on the scene in front of us, on a television, on a monitor, in a magazine, in a newspaper, a photograph, every image is formed by radiation. Every single, it's formed by information that's manipulated in some way to form the image. Same thing here. This image, just like every other image that you see, is formed by information. Now, the information content that was absolutely required to form this image, that information content, think about it, is that which defines the appearance of a naked crucified man. That's the information that's necessary to form this, because that's what the image is. That information did not reside in the limestone. It did not reside in the air in the tomb, and it did not reside on the cloth initially. Where did that information reside? It was only inherent to the physical body, naked, of that naked crucified man that was wrapped within the cloth. Just for example, when you look at me, the information content that defines my appearance is inherent to my body. And that's what we say here too. So the information content must have been transferred by radiation. I went through a consideration of 5 and then 6 different options that can transfer information content from one location to another. We're in the information age. Now, for example, all the electronic devices that you carry, the information content is transferred from one location to another by electron flow in wires. But that doesn't work for the Shroud of Turin because there were not wires connecting every point on the body to every point on the cloth. So as you go through all these other options, they all fail. For example, I'm talking to you now so that the oral communication of information is taking place by waves in a medium. That would be air. Now, waves in a medium, if I'm talking to you, this man over here hears me as well. The waves in a medium don't communicate focused information. What we have here is a high resolution image, so that you can exclude a lot of these options for transferring information from one point to the other, because we have high resolution image being deposited on this. There's only one option that works to transfer the information content that is necessary to transfer from the body to the cloth, and that is radiation. Now, don't think that's weird, because the vast majority of information that your body receives every second of the day is due to radiation by photons entering your eyes, at least when you're awake.
Call that a photograph of the resurrection?
I would call it a radiation burn, which was similar to a photograph, because it effectively transferred the appearance, not the coloration, because all the color here is a sepia, a kind of a straw yellow sepia color. So it didn't communicate the coloration, but it actually communicated the distance between the body and the cloth. So in other words, this image is a negative image. Now, no artist, no painter can paint a negative image because he never sees one. We know a negative. Every image that I'm looking at here is a positive image. I never see a negative image unless I look at the film from the old style cameras. Okay, but well, this is just so interesting.
Okay, so for you, the key word is not photo. It is what? This is a what of the resurrection.
This is a radiation burn of the resurrection. Now, it has characteristics of an X-ray, because on this, and this feature has to be explained to understand it properly. You can see teeth underneath the lips. You can see the bones in the hand. There are scientific reports of individuals being able to find the vertebrae at the bottom of the backbone and on the separation of the bones in the skull. Now, in order, you have to get that information from the inside of the body onto the cloth. And how do you do that? It can only be done by radiation. Now, the bones on the cloth, what that means is that the radiation is coming from inside the body. Not just the surface of the body, but it's coming from inside the body, so that as every atom, the atoms are not disintegrating. That's a false concept. The atoms are making a transition into an alternate dimensionality. I have about a 40-page paper on that on shroud.com. You can also get it on my website, shroudresearch.net. I have 2 papers on how the disappearance of the body occurred. One paper from the biblical and theological perspective, the other paper from the physical and scientific perspective. I considered 8 different options for how the body physically disappeared. The one option that works and allowed post-resurrection appearances without people being destroyed in the process of reappearing is that Jesus was making a transition into an alternate dimensionality. We should recognize that even the Bible teaches alternate dimensionalities. Chuck Missler on the radio recently said that if you fully understand Genesis 1:1, you'll have no problem with any miracle in the whole Bible, because Genesis 1:1, God created time, He created space, and He created matter, all coming into existence at the first point of time. But He created them from outside of that three-dimensional or spatial reality plus the dimension of time. So we recognize a 4-dimensional reality, 3 of space. So you can take the corner of the room, X, Y, Z coordinate system, and locate any location in the entire universe based upon that being a coordinate system. That's our 3 dimensions of space plus time. We recognize 4 dimensions, spatial dimensions, yet the Bible requires God creating that 4-dimensional reality from outside. Modern physics recognizes that that's consistent with what they require. String theorists, to explain modern experiments in modern physics, hypothesize that there must be absolutely must be anywhere from 10 to 26 dimensions to explain their results in modern physics.
Okay, so just wrapping this up, so we have just a few minutes for Q&A. I did want to ask, because you do hold that this was indeed Jesus' burial cloth, yes. What are the implications of your research?
I think the implications are fantastic. The Shroud of Turin is the second most valuable possession of the human race, next to the Bible. The Bible gives the history of the human race from the first creation of Adam and Eve, which must be taken as literal individuals. So that the Shroud of Turin is the second most valuable possession of the human race. The Bible also gives us the program of salvation, so that that's the most important. But the Shroud of Turin then testifies to the literal accuracy of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and thus being the means of salvation. So that the Shroud, giving evidence for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, makes the Shroud a visual apologetic for the gospel, because that's what the gospel is: death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus.
That brings me to my next question. It's, as Christian apologists, how are we to integrate this in our overall defense of the Christian faith? And I'm going to ask this to you, Gary, because you've also written that we must be clear that even if the shroud did not belong to Jesus, nothing in Christianity is affected. Even though it reports the discovery of Jesus' grave clothes, the New Testament never claims that the shroud is genuine. So adding this new evidence, how can we integrate this to our overall apologetic?
By the way, the quote you gave, people used to ask me in the old days, what happens if they disprove this? Back when they were doing and that's when I said, disproving the shroud does nothing to disprove the Bible. They're different, and even today it's true, but we're not at the time where people are. This is back in the days, like I said, when they got the results from 1978 and they're doing the testing. Well, I'll do it this way. I have a lecture, a PowerPoint. I think naturalism, the philosophical worldview that says the natural world is all there is, and it's a supposition, almost always, watch in the literature, philosophically, it's treated very, very poorly as an argument. Ben and I just we published 3 reviews of one book, and the reviews were all different, but this was a University of Wisconsin philosopher book published by Ivy League Press, Columbia. And the guy starts out by saying, my purpose in this book is to take away from you, to divest you of any belief in miracles and the supernatural. And he starts by giving, stats on how much Americans believe in miracles and life after death, and saying, we have no data. Well, the naturalistic view, you can't prove naturalism's true, and you can't prove there's no God. And yet it's a all-pervasive table tilting, I call it, that looks down on every other view and judges you. And he says for the first 10 pages of the book, you need evidence, you need evidence, you need evidence. Don't tell me it's by faith. Don't tell me the Mormon view of burning of the bosom. I don't like burning the bosom theories. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you know. Because you don't have enough evidence for miracle, you don't have enough evidence for life after death. But his attitude, the naturalistic attitude, which he keeps telling you, more evidence, more evidence, more evidence, he has none for the background view that says naturalism is true or there is no God. You can't prove either one. In fact, I recently debated one of the top guys in the world on the subject, Michael Roos at Florida State, and we started out by saying, where's your evidence for naturalism and atheism? And he just hemmed and hawed. He said, you can't prove a universal negative. I said, well, then you can't be an atheist. Well, we did this, went on for 2 hours, and he never gave a response. So, now you said, how does this fit in? So I do this PowerPoint where I give 4 arguments for religion in general. Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Christians could stand shoulder to shoulder and say amen. Like near-death experiences show there's an afterlife. The Kalam cosmological arguments show there was a creator. And all that shows is that naturalism's wrong. Then I go to the second half of it, and there's 6 arguments for Christianity. Which religion's true? Christianity. And I give 6 arguments. The Shroud is one of my arguments. So 2 of my arguments, one is an historical argument for the resurrection, which I give a minimal facts argument, which in a sentence or 2 is you can use only those facts which atheist New Testament scholars allow, and you have enough of a basis to show that Jesus was raised from the dead historically. I think the Shroud is a separate artifact, archaeology, stands by itself, is one of my 6 reasons for saying Christianity is true. So we have religion in general, Christianity in particular. That's how I would use the Shroud as an additional argument that right now is nobody's close to refuting.
Did you want to add?
I lead with the Shroud of Turin. I find that the group that's most responsive to looking at the Shroud of Turin and considering the evidence on it is skeptics and scientists. And I know enough about it where I lead with the Shroud of Turin, and then I go to the Bible to give them evidence, additional evidence of the statements of the historicity of what we already see and recognize scientifically, because we're in a very scientific age. So people say, where's the scientific evidence? Well, that's where it is. So they're very responsive to that.
And as church laity who could be very interested in this subject and possibly overzealous, what would you say to them who would also want to lead with this type of information and talking to somebody else, but also, what would you say to them in terms of contextualizing it?
Yes, we're still looking for people who are overzealous regarding this. I'm sorry, we've not encountered those yet. And you might say I'm overzealous, but I'm not. I mean, this is just so exciting that what we're trying to do here, I have a team of a dozen people that meet with me every 5 or 6 weeks. We have a team of researchers in Richland, Washington. Richland is one of the premier research centers of the country. We do nuclear research in Richland. Mm-hmm. And so I've organized a team, and we didn't set off to prove any religious concept here, because the Shroud of Turin is not hardly mentioned at all in all of my 8-foot-long bookshelf on all of my apologetics books. It's just not mentioned, so it's not necessary to prove Christianity. Yet I think it's being raised up out of the quagmire of deception and false presuppositions in this era, shortly before Christ's return to the earth, to bring a new witness to people just prior to the rapture, that this evidence will then go into the tribulation or a wrath period that's coming just prior to Christ's second coming. So this will be evidence that's used to bring the millions of people to accept the historicity of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as indicated in the Bible.
All right, well, that was the last question. So we really appreciate your rigor in your research, and Gary also for putting out. You might be able to put out a 3rd book after he does that testing with the Shroud, but we really appreciate everything that you've done. So I'd like everybody to give these 2 gentlemen a hand.
Well, thank you, Gary. Thank you.
And we have about 10 minutes for open question and answer. So if you'd like to do that, you can just line up right here, and or you can raise your hand. In fact, if you don't want, because it's very fine.
While we're sitting here, on your website, you have that article, 17 arguments.
Yes.
17 arguments that the image of the Shroud is radiation,
yes,
right?
The title is Role of Radiation in Image Formation on the Shroud of Turin.
I'd suggest you folks get a hold of that if you're interested in the science, or you know somebody who would like to see the science for this being radiation burned.
Yes, and we do have brochures over here. We've tried to carefully word all of the evidences on the brochure over here. Please pick one up. My website is indicated, and my contact information is indicated on the brochure.
All right, questions now. Go ahead.
So on the Shroud of Turin, and like on the picture there, and all the pictures that you have, and you both talked about it today about the beard that's on Jesus' face. But in Isaiah 56, it says, I gave my back to those who beat me, and my cheeks to those who tore my beard. I did not hide my face from scorn and spitting. So that seems to be prophesying that they tore out Jesus' beard. But if Jesus' beard was torn out, then it wouldn't be on the Shroud of Turin if it was also the beard of Jesus. So how do you reconcile that?
Okay, so just to restate, so it goes on the recording, concerning Isaiah, Isaiah seemed to have prophesied that Jesus' beard was ripped out, and so it would not have appeared on the Shroud of Turin.
The actual Hebrew there says the hairs will be pulled out. Now, if you can think of a silly example, Three Stooges. Remember when Moe would reach over and grab Larry's hair and pull it out, and he'd go, ow, and he'd have a handful of hair? If you see somebody who grabs hair, like in a fight, and pulls hair out, you can have hair in your hand, and there's no gaps on the person's head or in their beard. Isaiah only says it would pull hairs out, and pulling hairs does not even leave gaps, let alone pull the beard off. So anybody who has their beard grabbed and people who pull hard enough to get a bunch of hairs, there's still going to be a beard on their face. So there's just no issue whatsoever.
I agree with that. Yeah, it would just be there were some of the hairs pulled out, but not all of them.
Okay, Kendra?
Thank you so much. This is really interesting. So I think you had mentioned that you think that the person on the shroud is around 170 pounds.
Yes.
Is there any way of determining or hypothesizing about the age or ethnicity of the person?
So to restate the question, is there a way to determine the age or ethnicity of the person, given that you can also seem to analyze some characteristics such as the person in the shroud being 170 pounds?
Yes, the only, I've heard speculations regarding the weight being between 170 and 175 pounds and the height being about 5'10", somewhere between 5'8" and 5'12". 5'10" is a good number, but I've not discovered any speculation as to ethnicity, for example. The DNA is very old, of course, and so they've not been able to do a complete genome on the blood, for example. They've determined some aspects of the blood, AB, male, high in bilirubin, which is a chemical made by torture, believe it or not. So.
We report way back in our first book in '81, an ethnologist named Carlton Kuhn. I think he's from Harvard. I'm not positive. He said that the ethnicity of the man of the shroud in modern terms would be an Jewish/Arab descent, would be that Middle Eastern type of ethnicity.
Isaiah?
So you mentioned different dimensionalities.
Yes.
So is what you're positing that the moment that this radiation burn was created, that it was Jesus raising into a glorified form that burned into this? Is that the idea?
Yeah, just the science of it would require that this piece of cloth indicates that whatever caused this, let me back up a little bit. This is the only example of this. There's no other piece of cloth that was made by a burst of radiation from within a dead or living person to create an image on a piece of cloth. This is the only one. So therefore, there's no mechanism known to science that would cause this. Therefore, this is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics.
So you're actually thinking that it could be like a transition of dimensionality.
Yes. Now, in layman terms, where did the body of Jesus go? It went to heaven. That's layman terms. In physics terms, it would be that he made his body made a transition into an alternate dimensionality, commonly called heaven, so that his body didn't cease to exist. The atoms in his body didn't have to be recomposed or regathered for the post-resurrection appearances. No, just by his will, because it's a spiritual body under the control of his spirit, okay, of his will. So by his will, he makes a transition back into the upper room, by a transition from the alternate dimensionality back into our four-dimensional perception. Okay, that's what a post-resurrection appearance would be. So that there's no huge energy release, for example, like a nuclear weapon going on. That's not occurring. Because the shroud exists, the tomb exists, Israel still exists. If the entire mass of this body was turned into energy, it would be 1,000 times more powerful than the strongest nuclear weapon ever set off. That would have totally destroyed Israel. So the body did not appear or disappear by a disintegration of the atoms. It happened by a transition into an alternate dimensionality. That's the best solution to all the data that we know of. And you can read that on my paper on how the body disappeared.
One comment, if you're into things like design, intelligent design, and things like that, think about, if this is everything we've said today, think about the moment that this would have occurred. The man in the shroud is dead. He's in a state of rigor mortis, there's post-mortem blood flow, separation of blood and serum. There's about 6 different evidences that the man in the shroud is dead. Imagine what would happen if that picture had come 5 seconds later and the man under the cloth is given off the radiation, but he's alive. How long would it take somebody to say, oh, the swoon theory, he never died, the man underneath the cloth is alive? So you have to have this exact moment where he is still dead and presumably just beginning to set off, you're seeing the beginning of resurrection, but he's still dead. So the process hasn't gone very far because, you know what I mean, he's got to be both dead and rising. If he's alive and rising, you have swoon. Well, you don't have swoon. You have rising, but it's a natural rising, right? Jesus is walking around and he's healed now and he's showing everybody his wounds. He never died in the first place. But he's got to be dead and there's got to be resurrection. In fact, that's the gospel. Bob said, you got the gospel here. You got to have death and resurrection. But it's at the precise moment where the man underneath is still dead, not alive, or that would be a wholly different theory we'd be trying to answer today.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the burst of radiation. Maybe I didn't fully answer that. You have to explain the characteristics of the discolored fibers. It's in a thread would contain 1 to 200 fibers. Only the top 1 or 2 layers of fibers are discolored. If you look at one individual fiber, a fiber would be about 15 to 20 microns in diameter. A micron is a millionth of a meter, but the discoloration layer on that is 360 degrees around, but only about 0.2 microns thick. How in the world do you produce that? And the discoloration, if you could hold this. A carbon atom has 4 electrons in the outer orbit, usually associated with 4 atoms binding that carbon atom together. And that then reflects the normal color of linen. But if you take one of those electrons and move it over to associate it with 1 atom here, so you have 2 electrons associated with an atom here, 1 electron associated here, 1 electron associated here, no atom here. That's going from a single to a double covalent bond, if you have chemistry background. That's what's required to produce this image. And to shift from single covalent bonds to double covalent bonds requires a burst of energy so that that energy is focused to accomplish that before the energy is dissipated. That's why I refer to it as a burst of energy.
Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead, Josh.
You said that the radiation burst was more than 1,000 times as powerful as
No. See, what I said, people have talked about how did the body disappear, and they're thinking in terms of the atoms being turned into energy. And my argument is that did not happen because according to Einstein's theory, E equals mc squared. You can calculate the amount of energy that would be released by the total transfer of 170 to 175 pounds of matter into pure energy would be 1,000 times the energy of the strongest nuclear weapon that was ever exploded on the planet Earth. And so that would have, of course, destroyed the shroud, the tomb, Jerusalem, and most of Israel. And that has not happened. So my argument is that the atoms did not disintegrate. They made a transition into an alternate dimensionality.
Mark?
I have two questions. One of them is the conference that you had last year, 2017. Are you planning another one coming up sometime down the road? And the second question is, where do you get this really cool picture?
Yes, you can get pictures like this from Shroud.com, Barry Schwartz.
Yeah, I mean, the nice printed version of it.
Yeah, yes, isn't that nice? Yes, these conferences are put on by individuals who are simply motivated to put in their time and their money to do so. Most of this research is accomplished by volunteers spending their own time and putting in their own money to do it. There's no government funding on this. There's no institutional funding as such. Now, we have a need for about $8 million to establish a Shroud Center in the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill Research Triangle, 20,000 square foot building, $8 million required. So if you want to write out a check to test the Shroud Foundation, we can, there are people that would take $1 million and just consider that round off, okay? I don't, but there are people who do that. And so
if you were to, if somebody wanted to donate, where would you go to help your?
Test the Shroud Foundation. You can give me a check. I'll transfer it to Test the Shroud Foundation and deposit it. That's where I put some of my money. Okay. So the next conference is being arranged by another man up south west of Toronto, Canada. At Redeemer University College in August of 2019. And we're going to be participating. We're going to be helping on the advertising on that. So it's just people coming together. When one person announces it, they'll hold it someplace. They'll make the arrangements. Then other people come together and say, well, let us help you.
Anything else? Ben, did you?
I came a bit late. I remember, so you mostly talking about the issue of the radiation, right, of cloth, and is that part of the larger argument as far as whether the body exited the cloth prematurely? Because that's the point that Dr. Habermas raised in his book, his older book, The Historical Jesus, where I believe you raised in that book, Dr. Habermas, maybe you can correct me if I'm referencing the wrong book, where you talked about whether the person in the shroud exited the cloth prematurely.
So to restate the question, concerning the radiation, is it part of a larger overall argument where the body exited the shroud prematurely?
Right. That might be a better question for Habermas.
Okay. Did you get that?
I think so, but I don't know what you mean by prematurely. What do you mean yeah, I don't think that's my word, but what did... We talked about it earlier. Do you mean... Well, we talked about it being in the cloth, not unwrapped, and yet the bloodstains are intact, or the majority of the bloodstains are intact. And so whatever happened, the body's gone, but it was not unwrapped. And Robert Buckland, in our postscript of our first book, we talked about this earlier, Robert Buckland said that forensically, that is what you would describe on a CSI kind of description of what happened, if that's what you mean. But I don't know where the word premature comes in. I wouldn't even know what that means in this context. But in other words, whatever happened. Now, here's another example. The women come to the tomb. Jesus is already gone. The stone hasn't been rolled away. He didn't walk out and roll the stone back and keep walking. He's just not there. So it would seem that the Bible requires that Jesus dematerializes and rematerializes with stone, later dematerializes and rematerializes in a room, but he's a physical body in all of its, you can hug him, you can, but he's gone from the tomb, he comes through the walls. So the shroud, whatever it is, one more would be, he's through the cloth, through the rock, through the walls.
Yes, his disappearance you might say that it was premature in the sense that he didn't continue to rot. Normally a body would decay, and there would be decay products found on the cloth. No decay products were found on the Shroud of Turin. He did not decay. Decay starts after about 2 days, where you would then, you could detect body decay products on the cloth, so that he exited the cloth prematurely in that sense, that there was no decay products found on the cloth.
All right. Well, that's all we have time for questions. So I'd like everyone to give these two gentlemen another round of applause. Thank you, guys.